second I walk in the door. We have a meeting that begins right around 3 o'clock. So as soon as I walk in the door, I can give everybody kind of an idea of what's going on. If the weather looks like it's getting active earlier, then I'll go in earlier for sure. Otherwise, on a garden variety kind of a day, I have a meeting at 3 o'clock. Then I start working on some graphics. I do a lot of social media. I work on, I do the weather for the Sun Sentinel. So I have to have that sent in by a certain time. I also do the weather for our radio partners. There are about 4 different radio stations that I do the weather for. And we have several rounds of those. I do one in the afternoon, and then I do one in the evening as well. And then I work on my graphics for the 90-minute newscast, provided I'm not in the 3. Sometimes I fill in on the 3, but Michael Ehrenberg generally does that. So our newscast is kind of comprised, the one I do that starts at 5 is comprised of 3 half-hour segments. So I usually am on air about 3 or 4 times per half hour. So I build all the graphics for those. And then between that newscast, which wraps up at 6:30, I do a Facebook Live, I do some more social, I do some more newspaper, and then I work on the graphics for our 11 o'clock newscast that runs from 11 to 11:30. And depending upon the day, sometimes I'll fill in wherever I need to. Sometimes I'll do the 10 o'clock on the CW, but Michael generally does that. But so I'm kind of all over the place. We do way more than just on air. In fact, the actual on air portion that you see in a newscast is just a teeny tiny little snippet of what the day involves.
Oh, that's awesome. All right. So what
was that too much for you?
No, you're good. It's perfect. But what inspired you to pursue meteorology in the first place?
You know, the one thing that when I went to school initially, I always knew I liked public speaking. In fact, I minored in theater. And when I was in college at Illinois State, I couldn't decide if I wanted to be in television or if I wanted to be in theater and I wanted to be on stage. I just loved public speaking or, you know, mass communication of some sort. And my parents really kind of guided me toward the television side of it because I think they thought that that would be a little bit easier to get a job in that versus becoming an actor. I think they thought that I could support myself a little bit better that way. And then once I got into working in television at the television station that was on campus, TV10, we did 2 half-hour live newscasts every single day. And I took that class as often as I could. I took it, you know, as an elective, and then I took it as an on-campus internship. And there are many different ways that we could take it and get some credit for it so that I could build up a resume reel. And over the course of that, we had to alternate into different positions. One day we'd be a reporter, one day we'd be a photographer, one day, you know, we'd direct, or we'd be on the floor as a director, that sort of thing. And I always gravitated to doing weather for some reason, and nobody else wanted to do it. And I don't know if it's because it was ad-libbed, because weather's the only ad-libbed part of the newscast. So we don't have a teleprompter that we're using to read any of our graphics or read anything, you know, off of. We have to look at our graphics so that we can see where to point when we're standing on the green screen. So I enjoyed being able to ad-lib and just kind of speak off the cuff. And so with that aspect of it, I gravitated to doing weather. I think everybody else was more of sort of the creative arts kind of artsy fartsy kind of person, and they just didn't feel comfortable talking about something they didn't really know anything about and ad-libbing about it for a matter of 3 or 4 minutes on live television. And even though I didn't have the meteorological background at the time, for whatever reason, I was comfortable with doing it. And it just seemed like I was the only one who wanted to do that. So I kept doing that over and over and over. I am also an outdoorsy kind of person. So I've always had an interest in what's going on in the sky and what's going on around me. I was raised in the Chicago area. My parents are still on the same property, and it butts up against a forest preserve. So I was always really fascinated by just, things around me, the trees, the sky, how the sky interacts with the ground, and the weather that would come in. In the Chicago area, you see a tremendous amount of weather. Nothing, tropical like here necessarily, but certainly had our fair share of some weather to track there. So kind of a combination of a love of being outdoors and a love of public speaking that led me to the weather portion of it. And then in a roundabout way, I had to go back and get the meteorology to kind of back up what I was talking about. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Let's see.
I see we have more people on the call.
Yeah, we had a few latecomers that just joined. I admitted them, and then some people are getting booted, so they keep coming in and out.
I know. I want whatever Michael's eating over there. You guys are looking like you're enjoying yourselves. Can I take a quick picture of everybody before I lose some of you?
Yeah.
There you go. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
All right, cool.
Okay, so I'm sorry, what was the next question?
Let's see. So what degrees did you get when you went to school? Because you were saying that you went to Illinois and you went to Mississippi. Did you get like 2 bachelors, a bachelor and a master's?
Yeah, so it's the equivalent of 2 bachelor's degrees. So when I was going through the Mississippi State program, it was a 3-year program, and they didn't even offer the degree online at the time. But it's basically the equivalent of geology, like a geography degree in geology. So it was an emphasis on broadcast meteorology, but I've got the degree in mass communication broadcasting emphasis, which came first. And then when I went back to school for the meteorology program. Now the certificate program, you take a few extra classes, which I took some extra classes at a different university in Tucson. That's where I was at the time. Then that gets you the geology.
All right. That's really cool also. And after studying meteorology in Mississippi, you went to Tucson, and a lot of us are Floridians, so we don't really, there's a big weather difference. Weather-wise, how was the transition between going from like Mississippi and like the Southeast over to Tucson?
Oh, wow. First of all, you have to get used to, instead of everything being terrain driven. So in Arizona, most everything is kind of terrain driven weather, right? You've got the mountains that impact the weather that moves in. And of course, you got monsoon during the exciting 3 months of the year, and you have to track that. But then transitioning over here, obviously everything was sea breeze driven as opposed to being driven by the mountains and the terrain of the area. So that certainly took a lot of getting used to. It's been quite the transition, even just for me personally, to try to get used to the humidity. I like the heat, but the dry heat, I think, is something that I prefer. So just kind of getting used to the humidity. But as far as forecasting, I mean, it's obviously very, very different. Here you have a lot more thunderstorms. There you kind of get storms 3 months out of the year. Once you get monsoon, you get that seasonal shift of winds, and everything kind of pushes in across the Gulf and up the Sierra Madre mountain range into southern Arizona and the Four Corners area. That's really when we have our severe weather. We have a lot more flash flooding in Arizona than here. Here we have more severe thunderstorm warnings and obviously a lot more tornado warnings. I think I can count on one hand the number of times we had to cover tornado warnings in Arizona, as opposed to here where it's, sometimes it can be several times a day.
I will take the next one in a sec. The weather radio is going off.
Yeah, I know the one. We have Michael, he's covering it. Let me double check my phone just to make sure that we're covered here.
I think he might have the Facebook Live because you guys aren't on the TV right now. I know that. If he's doing anything, it would be a Facebook Live. Because ET's on right
yeah,
now.
just a second. In fact, Zach is texting me right now. Hang on just a second. Sure that one tornado warning is a shaking. As per the severe weather policy. Okay. Sorry about that. We just had some questions from the folks who are back in the studio. It's kind of tough to get on the air with a tornado warning and also be on social media at the same time. So we're trying to divvy up all of those kind of duties. Who's doing what in the studio, who's doing what from home, who's doing what socially. Social media has really taken on a huge role in the television industry. After the recession, you know, a lot of people started just kind of, we started doing more with fewer people. Let's put it that way. You know, we had some people laid off, and we're probably going to see another round of this happening here, kind of a ripple effect of the coronavirus, I would imagine. But right around the time of the recession, I'd say 2008, a lot of stations cut people. And it was also the same time that social media really started to take off, and more people were getting their information via their cell phone, as opposed to tuning into a traditional newscast. So we have been dealing with this struggle, like kind of juggling social media and on air and trying to figure out what's more important. They're both equally important. How do we get information out on both at the same time? How do we still have that live presence with a human being, with a meteorologist giving the information? And so this has been, at every station I've ever worked, this has been kind of an ongoing struggle between, okay, who's going to do all the social media? How are we going to get that out fast? How are we going to still do the cut in on the air for the folks who don't utilize that? And we're fortunate enough at CBS 12 that we do have a huge staff. We now have 5 meteorologists. John Matthews, who's been at the station for almost, what I think 43 years, is getting to retire, getting set to retire at the end of May. So we are going to be losing him. Yeah, so we're going to be losing him. He's been staying at home because of the coronavirus anyway. And because there's a hiring freeze, we don't have anyone kind of like waiting in the queue to bring in. So now we've gone from 6 of us down to 5, but we do still have enough people where on certain days we can have 2 or 3 people even in the studio to kind of cover things, which is very helpful. A lot of times we'll have to put one person out in the storm track truck to actually be out live, you know, showcasing the weather there. And then we'll have another person in studio, and then we have another person doing a lot of the digital. If we're in a situation with a hurricane, then it's all hands on deck, and we kind of rotate out doing 12-hour shifts, or sometimes we're there a lot longer than that, you know, and we're doing the social media at the same time that we're doing the on air. But I was just responding to a text about, okay, we got on the air for the tornado warning, but we didn't have someone to do the Facebook Live. So, you know, the digital team wants it to be digital first, and the news folks always want the on air to be first. And there's this, you know, kind of tug of war that's kind of always happening. But, you know, digital is a big part of how people get our news now. So we certainly always try to take that into consideration and cover that. That was a long answer to tell you about why I was looking at my phone, wasn't it?
No, I actually think it actually flowed really nicely into our next question.
Good.
So our next question is, because of course, meteorology, and particularly broadcast meteorology, is not just about the science, it's about communicating the weather. So what were some challenges in Tucson of public messaging that you had? Because here in Florida, we talk a lot about messaging of hurricanes, rip currents, and lightning. I imagine some of the challenges might be a little bit different out there.
Yeah, we have a lot of challenges. In Tucson, we had quite a bit, and kind of similar here. We had a really large population of people who were primarily Spanish speaking. We do have here at CBS 12, we also have Azteca. So when we have a hurricane or a tropical storm or a really big weather event, we are able to kind of like call people in who can speak Spanish and broadcast in Spanish as well. That was a similar concern that we had in Arizona, trying to get the message out in 2 different languages to make sure that we weren't ignoring any portion of the population. It's interesting. One of the things that I think National Weather Service is actually considering right now is streamlining some of the verbiage that they're using for their advisories. I know they sent out an email just the other day that they're considering doing away with like winter weather advisories and flood advisories, and just trying to stick to the watch versus warning kind of vernacular so that it's not as confusing, because a lot of people think of an advisory and they think of a watch sort of a situation. And one of the things that has always been a struggle is explaining what an aerial flood advisory is. For some reason, people just don't get it. They don't know the difference between a flood watch and a flash flood warning and a flood advisory. And I have to admit, it is kind of confusing, especially if you're having to talk about all 3 of those going on in your viewing area all at once. It's like, well, okay, so flood advisory is this and a flash flood warning is this, and then we're seeing this over here. And flooding was a big concern, believe it or not, in the desert during monsoon, because all of the water that rains over the mountains all day, you can get flooding down in the washes and the arroyos pretty quickly, and people can wash away, even though the sky over where you're at is clear and sunny. There have been lots of situations where people are washed away in the canyons because of storms that have just kind of hung out over the mountains all day, dumped a tremendous amount of water, and then it flows downstream. And sometimes children who are playing in the washes and stuff like that, they have unfortunately gotten swept away. So you wouldn't think you'd be talking about flooding that much in the desert, but you really do, because the ground, there's no grass, right? And the soil is really hard. It's something they call caliche, and it doesn't really absorb water very quickly. So as soon as it rains, it just runs off. And when you have those big thunderstorm cells that dump, a downburst or something, you've got 2 or 3 inches of rain all in one spot. If you picture that happening over the mountains, perhaps all day long, then you're definitely going to have flash flooding. I mean, I can't recall a monsoon where we didn't have at least 1 person die in a flash flood. So trying to get the message across as far as flooding is concerned. And Arizona is similar to Florida, and so far as you have a lot of visitors from other parts of the country and other parts of the world, and maybe they're not in tune with what's going on because they're too busy, being out at the beach and enjoying the ocean, or in Orlando, enjoying Mickey Mouse, or, something like that. And they're not aware of just how quickly the weather can change on a dime. So you have to just make sure that you're really kind of getting the word out to everybody. I do know that when you go to a lot of the canyons in Arizona, say someone, is from another part of the country where they don't have mountains and they're going up to hike, they will post signs all over the place, to stay weather aware. And if you do see storms over the mountains, to try to get off the mountain as fast as possible, and or head to higher ground, especially if you're near one of the creeks or something that would run through and fill up really quickly. So they try to spread that message as much as possible in Arizona. But you have some people who also don't take the heat very seriously there, and every year people perish because of the extreme heat. They might not realize that they're getting dehydrated as quickly as they are, and maybe they're outside doing a lot of hiking all day long because it is so dry and they're perspiring so much. Heat stroke sets in pretty quickly. I had a situation where I was hiking with my father, who is from Illinois. And although he had been out to visit me quite a few times, we decided to go hiking on Picacho Peak, which is between Tucson and Phoenix. And turns out that it just ended up taking us longer than we anticipated. And the peak heat of the day, I mean, it was well over triple digits. And where we were at there, you know, there's not a lot of shade, right? You're out in the desert. You can hide behind like the shade of a saguaro cactus maybe, but that's just about it. And so he got heat stroke very, very quickly. And I wasn't quite sure that any of the park rangers were going to be able to get to him. I called the park rangers, as a matter of fact, and they could not get to the milepost that we were at. So thank goodness I had an ice pack with me. I had a little bit of water still remaining in my Camelback. He had already had all of his. And so we put an ice pack under his baseball cap, and that cooled his head off just enough so that he wasn't as lightheaded and he was able to continue to hike on. And then we finally made it to the trailhead, and that's where the park rangers were able to pick us up and then take us to our car, which was about another mile walk to the parking lot. So, you know, situations like that, a lot of times you just don't realize that you're getting dehydrated. And when heat stroke kicks in, then it's kind of like a little too late. And if it happens during the peak heat of the day, you're kind of stuck there if you're out of water. So the message there obviously is to try to you know, you think about drinking water, but you really have to hammer that point home that heat stroke can kick in pretty quickly. You know, here it's hot, but it doesn't get like over 100 degrees. It feels hotter than what it is, obviously, because of all the humidity, but there in the desert, it doesn't feel as hot because it's so dry. So you don't realize, you know, that heat stroke could potentially move in. So, you know, every area of the country has its own cross to bear, I suppose, and has different messages that you're trying to convey.
Yeah, I have some experience hiking in New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And for the weird areas that basically they wouldn't let people go hike past a certain time in the afternoon because they
Right.
just weren't going to let it happen because of the flash flood risk.
Yeah, during monsoon, and I'm an avid hiker, and during monsoon, I almost never hiked, just because of that risk and that warning. It's just really tough to see if try to figure out how far away a storm is and if that is going to produce enough rain to create the flooding downstream. So flash flooding is just that, it happens in a flash. So you can't really, it's really tough to stay on top of that. So I don't even hike during monsoon as much as I love to hike. I try to do it when I know it's going to be drier.
Yeah, a quick administrative note before we move on to the next question. This Zoom link is set to expire in about 7-8 minutes. So when that happens, no one worry. If you go into the same link, they'll put us right back to where we are, and that'll be how we'll just finish it off from there. Our plan is to go to audience questions once in that new link.
Okay.
So while we have about 7.5 here, could you go over a little bit of an overview of the role of broadcast meteorology? Because I think everyone's more or less familiar with the role of National Weather Service,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe even some private sector forecasters. But there's a lot more to broadcast than just being on TV. It's a whole integrated team. At least that's how we try to act as an integrated team. So can you explain a little bit how the role of broadcast is in that?
Absolutely. So we're kind of the middleman between, say, National Weather Service and the viewing audience, right, and the public sector. So I've always found that, you can usually, and you may have experienced this too, the meteorologists, broadcast meteorologists tend to fall into two different categories. You've got the one who, is more of the talker and the creative thinker, but maybe not so much the scientist, or you've got, the meteorologist who is more science and can't really take these scientific terms, even though they know them really well, and make them relatable to our viewers. So a broadcast meteorologist, the best ones that I have come across kind of use both parts of their brain, the left side and the right side, equally well, because we have to disseminate the information that's coming out from the National Weather Service, which if you've never had any weather training, can obviously be a little bit complicated and a little bit thick at times, but then make it relatable to the average everyday person. So what does this mean to somebody who's watching, who's out, driving around in a storm right now, kind of thing. So you have to get the message out, because we are, for the most part, partnered with the National Weather Service to try to get the message out to people and save lives as quickly as possible. So you have to just do it in a way where people understand. You don't want to panic people, but you want to really impress upon them how serious sometimes a situation is. And you want to keep them and keep yourself as calm as possible, so they stay calm, so that they can make good judgment calls about what they need to do. And really just explain the difference between, preparing for something to happen and, oh, this is happening now, so this is what you need to do, in just a very quick, conversational kind of a manner. You have to be able to get the information out, but do it in a way that the average everyday person feels like you're just talking to them through a camera, very much like the way we are right now. And sometimes that can be tricky to do, because you've got this sciencey kind of a brain going, right? And you're like excited about, breaking down the storms and everything. But the garden variety person really just wants to know, are they safe? If not, what do they need to do? And is it going to rain tomorrow? Do I need to send my child off to school with a coat or rain boots, that sort of thing. So, I like to do explainers. I've had some news directors who really don't care for any of that. I think as long as you can do it in a quick enough manner to get it in during the 2.5 minutes that you perhaps have for doing your weather cast in a 30-minute newscast, and make it sound interesting, then I like to do the explanations of the weather, the why something is happening. If it helps tell the weather story of the day, I don't see why not. Where news directors get a little bit nervous is when they start hearing all these complicated terms that you're not really kind of explaining or breaking down, and they just think that the viewer is going to tune out at that particular point. So, I think having a good combination of both of those is really what will make for a really good broadcast meteorologist.
Sorry, it's gotten real windy over here now. Okay, yeah, I think the idea of looking at the weather as a story is a really important way of thinking about what we're trying to do. Because you think of a story, there's narration. There, the author is explaining the character's thoughts or the events that are happening in a book. So I like the idea of thinking about weather as a story a lot, actually.
Yeah, there are 3 parts of the job of a broadcast meteorologist, right? There's the forecasting part of it, and there's the building of the graphics, because most stations don't have a weather producer who builds all the graphics for you. That's something that we do ourselves, and that takes up a good majority of our time. And then there's the actual presentation of both of it. You're taking all the forecasting and all the weather that you did, you put it together with the graphics that you just built in the order that makes sense for you to tell the weather story. And then you actually present that weather story with the graphics to kind of help explain the science behind it and the forecast that you put together.
All right, real quick, since we have about 2 minutes on this link, can you explain the role of the chief meteorologist?
Yes, so at every station, it's a little bit different. John Matthews was the chief meteorologist at CBS 12, and was up until the time that I came in. Jeff Baradelli, who took over the newscasts that he had been doing, came in as severe weather expert. He still kind of, led the team and still did all of the evening newscasts and that sort of thing. But for the most part, the job of the chief is just kind of keep the team on the same page and kind of make sure that everybody's got, you know, their duties that are being divvied up. Okay. Like what I was just talking about right now. Okay. Yes, this is the person who's going to go on air when we do the sort of a cut in. This is the person who's going to drive the digital part of that. This is the person who's going to be out live, and just kind of coordinating if we do a team coverage sort of an event, who's doing what. At this station, I also do the schedules for all of the meteorologists. And so it's a matter of making sure we have all the shifts covered when we need to, and people are taking time off. Okay, coordinating, can you do this newscast, or if I do this one, can you fill in here? And that's a big part of the chief job at this station. My last station, the chief didn't do that. We had somebody else who kind of did all that, but just sort of leading the weather charge. You know, when I first got to CBS 12, we didn't have like a severe weather policy in writing. So, you know, it was just kind of like one person would jump in and say, okay, I'll hurry up and I'll get the radio done right now. And I'll go do the cut-ins and I'll do this and I'll do that. And sometimes, you know, it just led to some delays. So put together a policy of how we're going to cover things, both from a crawl standpoint and a cut-in standpoint,